In this section, we'll link the global AML CFT framework to what actually happens in your institution. You'll see how FATF, the UN, and national regulators shape expectations, and how those expectations become concrete controls, policies, and daily responsibilities for you and your teams. Picture AML and CFT regulation as water flowing downhill. At the source, international standard setters like FATF define broad principles and expectations. These aren't directly binding on banks, but they shape everything below. Each country then converts those principles into its own laws. Regulators take those laws and issue sector-specific rules and guidance. Finally, individual firms turn all of that into internal policies, monitoring systems, and daily procedures. The labels may differ by country or sector, but the underlying expectations are surprisingly consistent. When we talk about AML and CFT standards, three players dominate, each in a different way. The United Nations creates binding law through conventions and Security Council sanctions. Firms must comply, especially with sanctions lists and asset freezes. FATF doesn't make law, but its 40 recommendations and country evaluations define what an effective AML CFT regime looks like. Regulators build their rules around this. The Wolfsberg Group is industry-led. Its guidance isn't mandatory, yet banks treat it as a practical benchmark when designing detailed controls and procedures. FATF also works through a network of regional bodies. It sits at the center, setting global AML and CFT standards, then relies on these groups to promote and test implementation locally. Bodies like MONEYVAL, APG, ESAAMLG, and GAFILAT assess how well countries in their regions are applying the rules. Their findings feed into FATF's mutual evaluation reports. Those reports matter directly to you. Banks and other institutions use them to set country risk ratings, design controls for cross-border business, and decide where to de-risk. Poor ratings can mean gray or blacklisting and an immediate increase in business risk. AML rules don't appear from nowhere. They begin with international standards, such as FATF recommendations and UN resolutions. Countries then convert these into primary legislation, typically AML CFT acts and criminal codes that define offenses and penalties. Regulators next translate the law into detailed regulations and rules. That's where you see explicit requirements for CDD, monitoring, reporting, and record keeping. Finally, guidance notes add practical interpretation. They explain how to apply the risk-based approach, give examples, and show what good practice looks like in your sector. To understand any country's AML ecosystem, think of a three-part partnership. Regulators and supervisors set the rules for firms, license them, and test whether controls actually work. They can demand remediation and impose fines. Financial intelligence units are the analytical hub. They receive suspicious transaction reports, connect the dots across institutions, and pass high-value intelligence to investigators. Law enforcement and prosecutors then use that intelligence to trace funds, seize assets, and bring ML or TF cases to court. Where these three exchange information quickly and trust each other, the national AML system functions. Where links are weak, criminals exploit the gaps. In practice, the risk-based approach is about adjusting how hard you push controls, rather than applying the same intensity everywhere. When you see complex ownership, high-risk jurisdictions or PEPs regulators expect heavier treatment, enhanced due diligence, more documentation on source of funds and wealth, senior management sign-off, and tighter, more frequent reviews. For straightforward retail customers and simple products, you can rely more on standard CDD, some simplification, and automated monitoring. What regulators look for is clear, defensible logic in how you allocate effort and controls to risk. Customer due diligence is a sequence, with each step building on the previous one. You start by identifying and verifying the customer using reliable independent sources. If this foundation is weak, everything else is compromised. Next, you determine who really owns or controls the customer, especially in layered corporate structures. Then you understand the nature and purpose of the relationship, why they need the account, expected activity, and sources of funds or wealth. Finally, you translate those insights into a risk rating and select standard, simplified, or enhanced due diligence accordingly. Ongoing monitoring connects what you learn at onboarding with how the customer behaves over time. Think of two layers working together. First, point-in-time checks. You collect full CDD information when the relationship starts, then refresh it on a risk-based schedule. That gives you a baseline. Second, continuous checks. You monitor transactions against that baseline, screen for sanctions and negative news, and react quickly to trigger events like unusual spikes, new ownership, or major life changes. Underpinning everything is strong record keeping, so investigators and regulators can reconstruct the full story years later. When you see something suspicious, consider two tracks: what happens inside the firm and what may go outside to the FIU. Internally, an alert is detected, investigated against the customer profile, and, if concerns remain, escalated to the MLRO or compliance officer. Throughout, confidentiality is critical. If there are reasonable grounds to suspect money laundering or terrorist financing, the institution must file an STR or SAR and any required large cash or cross-border reports. Across this whole process, one rule is absolute: never tip off the customer that a report or investigation exists. You can think of AML CFT governance as a living tree. The board is the canopy. It sets the tone, defines risk appetite, approves policies, and demands clear reporting. If the canopy is weak, everything beneath struggles. Senior management and the MLRO form the trunk. They turn intent into structure: budgets, systems, people, and processes. Crucially, the MLRO must have real authority and independence, not just a title. Frontline and operations are the roots. They touch the soil every day, onboarding customers, performing CDD, spotting unusual activity, and pushing concerns upward. When canopy, trunk, and roots are aligned, your AML program is both stable and responsive. Overall, AML operates as a living ecosystem. Global bodies like FATF set standards. Countries translate those into laws and regulations. Firms then build CDD, risk-based controls, and monitoring to comply. When you detect a concern and file a report, it flows to the FIU, which turns data into intelligence and potential law enforcement action. Those outcomes reveal new typologies and gaps, which feed back into the next round of global standards. The key takeaway: you are not a checklist operator. You are a frontline sensor in this global loop.